Hello ladies and gentlemen, in this video I'm going to be doing a code critique of the Snapigram app. This is an app written in React Native, and I'll put a link to an article in the description below that gives some more details about the app. Now, I'm going to provide some suggestions of some things that can improve the code here without actually changing any of the functionality of the app itself. And the reason you'd want to consider improving your code in this way is because if you're working with someone, or even if you're working with yourself, having a nice consistent pattern will make things much more efficient and a lot easier to work with in the future. Another reason is in a professional environment, you will probably be expected to have some sort of consistent style, and you may actually have a company mandated style that you'll need to adhere to. So let's begin. Okay, I've got all the files open, and the first thing I want to point out is the use of white space in this code. As I'm scrolling through the document, I can see that there's a pretty inconsistent use of new lines to separate blocks of code. And while it's normally a good idea to use new line characters to separate functional blocks of code, you really don't want to have huge gaps like we can see throughout this file. The reason you don't want to have large gaps is because if someone's reading through the code, seeing a large gap like that might cause them to break their concentration slightly. And another reason is because it takes up more vertical space and you won't be able to fit as much code into a single view without scrolling. For horizontal white space, there's also a lot of inconsistency here. As we can see in this first function, there's only one space between the start of the function and the first line of code, and there are two spaces for the ending bracket. If I scroll down, I can see here's some consecutive lines of code that aren't lined up. And generally, you should be using a consistent form of indentation throughout all of your code. You can use whatever size indentation you want. Some people prefer 2 spaces, some prefer 4 spaces, some people use tabs, but you should just be consistent throughout your code. In terms of formatting, another inconsistency I found was the bracket style being used here. There's 2 popular forms of placing brackets, and one of them is to have the bracket on the first line of code, and the other is to have each bracket on its own line. And as we can see here, both methods are being used throughout this file and the other files. What I've seen most common in JavaScript is the style of having the bracket on the same line of code, but that's really a personal preference, and you should try to be consistent in all of your code. The reason that consistency is important here is because it helps you to identify patterns as you're scanning through the code, and if you see a break in the pattern, it could be an indication that you've done something wrong. One way that you can very easily take care of a lot of these issues is by taking advantage of auto-formatting that's built into most code editors. I'm using Visual Studio Code, and if I right-click anywhere in the document, I can choose Format Document, and it'll take care of a lot of these issues for me. It won't take care of all of them, but it's a good start. And so I'm going to try to manually correct some of the issues that were not handled by formatting the document. The next area where we can make a small improvement is in the function naming styles. As you can see in the home screen, we've got a function called getPosts, which is using what's known as the camel case style, and that's where the first word of the function is lowercase, and every subsequent word begins with a capital letter. And we can see as we look through the functions, the next function also uses camel case, but this function uses an underscore. And actually, if we jump over to the image editor file, and look through some of the functions, we can see that this function actually starts with the capital letter and the next word is with a lowercase letter. Here we've got almost all capital letters except for the word to, and same with this function here. And in this case, I prefer to use the camel case style, and the reason is because that's the style that React Native uses, and you can tell because all of the lifecycle methods like component will mount are using camel case style. The reason using a consistent function naming style is helpful is because JavaScript is case sensitive, and it's easier to remember a single rule that all of your functions will be named using the camel case style, rather than trying to remember if this function began with a capital letter or if one of these was a camel case function and so on. So I'm going to change all the functions. I don't have an automated way to do this, but some code editors do. So I'm just going to use find and replace to change all of these functions. One thing you should always try to do before releasing your code in any sort of production scenario is remove any debugging code that you may have added during your development. And as I was reformatting some of these files, I noticed that there are a lot of console.logs in here, and some of them may be legitimate. For example, in this case, there's no access token, so there's a console.log. But a lot of these just looked like they were used for testing purposes, like this one that says uploading the image. And it's okay to use those during development, but you should try to take them out so that they don't clutter up your code and even maybe cause performance issues. So if I press Control-Shift-F on this editor, I can search for console.log, and I can see that there are 36 results in this set of files. So I'm going to look through those, and I'm going to delete the ones that, to me, look like they were just debugging code. Okay, I've cleared out a lot of the console.log statements, but as you can see, there are still 6 remaining. I left those 6 in there because they were dealing with error situations, and although on a React Native app, the user probably won't see statements logged to the console, they may one day be converted to some sort of user feedback. And on that same token, it's a good idea to make sure that you spell everything right in case you are presenting something to the user, so it will look a little bit more professional. This code editor doesn't have it, but it is possible to install spell checks on your code editors just to make sure that you're spelling everything correctly. So you should try to use correct spelling and correct grammar and capitalization rules and all of that so that your app looks a little bit more professional. And I also noticed over on the login screen, the name of the screen itself was actually misspelled. I don't think it has any functional impact, but also something to look out for. Something else I noticed as going through the files is what's known as dead code. And dead code is code that's commented out and no longer does anything. It's tempting to leave commented out code in your code because you think to yourself, maybe I'll use that code one day. But the reality is this code is not executing and it's not being tested. And if you come back, say, in a few months and decide you want to use that, there's no guarantee that it even works anymore because other changes to the code may have been made. So I think it's a good idea to delete commented out code before releasing a product. And if you really feel like you need to save that code, if you use source control, you can always go back to it and find it there, or you can reference it in another file somewhere outside of your normal code base. There weren't too many instances of this, so I'm just going to scan through the files and delete them as I see them. Something I just noticed is the use of the ternary operator in the render function on the home screen. I love the ternary operator, and I think it's very useful in a lot of scenarios. If you're not familiar with it, what you do is you provide a Boolean and then a question mark and the return value if that Boolean is true, and then a colon and the return value if that Boolean is false. And although the ternary operator is great here, I think that there's a little bit too much code in between the question mark and the colon, and it can cause those two characters to get lost. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out this piece of code and put this into a render loading method. And I'm going to move this piece of code into a render list method. And now we can use the ternary operator, but there will be a lot less code in between, and it should be a little bit easier to scan through and figure out what's going on. So if this .state.isLoading is true, I'm going to render loading. Otherwise, I'm going to render the list. And we can return that. Perfect. Another thing that I think would be useful throughout this code is the use of constants for anything that looks like it could be data or it could potentially change at some point. And the main thing that I noticed is this URL here that I found in several places. If I do a Control-Shift-F for HTTPS, I can see that there are quite a few URLs throughout the code, and they all seem to start with this app.derogation85. Blah blah blah. So I'm going to pull this out and make a copy of it. And in our project source folder, I'm going to make a new folder called constants. And inside of that, I'm going to make a file called appconstants.js. And in there, we will export default some object, which will hold all of our constants. And for the URL that we just copied, we'll call that base URL and paste the URL that we just copied. So I'll save that. And now back in the home screen, I can import app constants from constants/app constants. And then here we can use app constants .base URL plus get posts. Now you may actually want to make a separate constant for the get posts URL, and you can do that just as easily by coming in here and making a get posts URL. And the nice thing about this is that it puts all of your URLs in one location, and if this URL were ever to change, you'd only have to change it in this one file, and all of your other code would still be functioning. So now we can change this to get posts URL. And I'm going to search through the rest of the code and look for areas where I can use these new constants. There's actually an area down here which is slightly different. This looks like the URL for images. So I'm going to copy this URL and put this in here and name it image URL. And here we will replace this whole thing with appconstants.image URL. And actually, since we have the exact same thing twice in this function here, we can pull this out into a variable. We'll call this image. And instead of having that in our render code, kind of cluttering it up, we'll just put that there. And since we made it a variable, we can avoid a little bit of duplication by reusing the variable. Okay, so I'll look through and try to find the other cases where we're using that URL. Maybe this one can be a separate function or a constant. Okay, I've gone through and made a couple more minor changes based on some things that we've already discussed, and in my opinion, the code is much cleaner, much more manageable, and a lot easier to read now. But none of the things discussed in this video are required for your code. They're just suggestions that, in my personal opinion, may improve your code in some situations. You can use some of them, or you can use all of them, and you can even use your own personal style in combination with those. Let me know if you think the code looks any better, or if there are things that you would have changed or done differently. And if you'd like me to critique your code, feel free to send it to me and I'll try to take a look. Thank you.